And we'll get started. So, Mike, welcome to the I Help Pastors Get Jobs meetup. I'm really glad to have you. How you feeling about 2023? Any New Year's resolutions for Mike Jarrell or not this year?
Man, I'm doing good. Thanks for having me, Eric. And I'd say probably two words. One is focus, and the other is stories. I think what what encourages me, what I think is the new metric of success is stories. And
Awesome.
so the different churches that I'm working with, I'm just wanting to cultivate an environment of storytelling where people are coming excited and anticipating both sharing and hearing of stories of how God's at work as they engage, really strategically in the places where they feel called.
Mm, Awesome. Awesome. I love it. Thanks for sharing. So for those who don't know your story, do you mind giving us a snapshot of your ministry background and kind of what does your day-to-day look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, grew up in the church, became agnostic, came back to faith over late night appetizers at an Applebee's over the course of a summer, and then went to Bible college, started working with youth in Philly, and then went from working with youth to feeling like the best way to impact teens. These kids would go back into really rough situations, and everything that I felt like I was doing was undone, and felt like I needed to work with families. And the church just exploded, Eric, in terms of numbers. It was a church plant, small group of people that I had met up with that had just started this church, and it grew from 30, 40 people to, we had 5 staff, multiple services, in the process of this building project to build a 1,500 seat facility. And the problem is pretty much all the growth in our church was transfer growth. People were coming from other churches. We weren't really reaching lost people. And I didn't see that people's lives were that much different than their neighbors. So it felt sort of like we were putting on a performance for church people that had come to us because we were cooler and our band was better and we had a better kids program. And I was asked to speak at a leadership conference in San Diego. I had been networking with some people who called themselves the missional architects, and they were doing house churches in the Rockies and missions work in Berlin and Africa. And they just had these incredible stories of how God was at work amongst people who would never ordinarily step through the doors of a church building. And so we went out. It was a week before my wife and I got married. They decided that they wanted to take me out after I spoke at the conference. And we went to this pub called the Blind Lady Ale House, a group of 10, 15 missionaries sitting around these bar top tables that were pushed together. And Eric, I don't know how to explain it other than it was one of those profound moments in life where the Holy Spirit just breaks through to you and you can't unsee what you saw. We're sitting around the table and these guys start sharing advice with me. They bought my food and drinks. Then one of the guys said, "Hey, I feel with Mike getting married next week that we should all take turns and share the biggest mistakes that we've made in our marriages." And then these guys go around the table, and some of it's hysterical. Whatever you do, never say this. Whatever you do, never do this. But then some of it got really vulnerable. You think that you could, never compromise or have an affair, but you find yourself in a vulnerable situation. And I just thank God for grace and my wife's forgiveness, and just these stories as guys are tearing up. And I'm like, man, this got real and vulnerable. And then a little later, one of the guys said, "Hey, I really feel like the Spirit's put it on my heart to buy a round of beer for the table next to us." I'm like, okay. So they bought around for the table next to us. The guys at the table next to us are like, who are you guys? You're like eating and laughing and crying, and you bought our drinks. And the guy's like, we're a group of missionaries and guys that are starting churches. And the guy's like, BS, no, you're not. Who are you really? And he said, no, we are. Why don't you join us? And the guy said, well, I'm an atheist. And he said, we don't care. Join us anyway. So this four top scooted over and joined us. And they were treated like insiders. We're laughing with them. They're talking about why they don't believe. We're talking about why we do what we do. And one of the guys at our table looked at them and said, I know you guys don't believe in any of this stuff, but our buddy Mike here is getting married next week, and I'd like to pray a prayer of blessing over him for his future marriage. And he's an Irish Marine, so he had that sort of persona. And he stood up and he held his stout and he prayed this like Celtic blessing over me in the middle of this pub. And I got to tell you, I sat back and it was like light bulbs, the book of Acts, breaking of bread, check, prayer, check, generosity, check, the Lord adding to our number, check, And I started thinking, this looks more to me like the book of Acts than what I'm currently doing. And so my wife and I got married. We went off on our honeymoon, and I told her, I think maybe God wants us to do Blind Lady Ale House Church or something. And instead of trying to get people to come to us, we just need to go to them and create a deeper sense of community and see those who would normally come to church be impacted by a community of people that come to them. And so we ended up gathering with some friends over chicken wings and trying to figure out how to be a community. And fast forward, we've got this local network of communities formed in all kinds of spaces, beauty salons and Renaissance fair and breweries and pubs and neighborhoods and various spaces where people feel called to be missionary disciple makers. And that kind of pretty much all of our growth came out of the harvest. And then Creo is just a larger collection of that all over the country, about 140 people doing stuff like this and see themselves as missionary entrepreneurs for the kingdom.
Man, what a profound story. I want to talk about Creo in a moment, but before we do, you're in Philly. You're living the dream a lot of pastors have. 40 people turning into a large building campaign, multi-staff, big auditorium. Everyone comes to hear me preach. I think there's a lot of pastors who think, oh my gosh, that's what I want. And you have this night at the restaurant where everything gets disoriented. Then you go on your honeymoon, you tell your wife, hey, let's do something different. My first question is, was your wife like, I don't know? Or were you like, I don't know? Or you both like, no, let's do it? Because I can imagine just where I'm coming from, Mike, it's like, that has to be really disorienting to say, hey, I had this trajectory and let's just throw a bomb in the whole thing and do something totally different. Like, what were you kind of processing on that trip with your wife?
I mean, she was in right away. She's like, yeah, but we had talked quite a bit about observations that, you get caught up in the excitement of things getting big fast and growing and kind of feeling like it's working, and other people talking about this is successful and good, and look at what's happening, the proof's in the pudding, God's at work. But inwardly you're looking around going, most people, when you ask them, have no idea what their spiritual gifts are. If they're not on staff, they're probably not actively making disciples. How many neighborhoods or workplaces are actually being transformed? So you have these like under the surface nagging questions, doubt, struggles that are going on. And then when you see something, it's just like the dots connect and you go, wait, I don't think that it's possible to have really close, authentic, and genuine friendships with a massive crowd of people, which is why large churches are trying to get people into small groups. But at the same time, you see people in small groups that are bored because they're inward focused. And so you're going, wait a second, I think really the order might be backwards. Instead of starting with church, and church is where we learn about Jesus, and then we try to get people out on mission, right? The people out on mission are maybe the Navy SEALs of Christianity. Send these like really crazy people out to the ends of the earth and give them money. But I think maybe the order is backwards, that we should start with Jesus, who came on mission and sent us on mission. And in mission determines what church looks like. So it's kind of, you look at your neighborhood, and for me, I'm looking around at the guys that I'm meeting who sit out in their garage and drink beer and watch sports. And I'm thinking, if I got to get them into a setting where we sing and read on a Sunday morning, that's a really hard sell. Now, I've had people tell me if they won't come, they're just cold to the gospel. I don't think that's the case. When I get to know them and talk to them and invite them to, sit around my table or hang out over some tacos and let the kids play together, or if we're sitting around a fire, guys get philosophical looking at flames. You hang out for a few hours, people get real about life. They're willing to help other neighbors with problems that are going on. And all of a sudden you see this community form, and questions start being asked, and spiritual activities happening right there in your home or in your neighborhood. And so the epiphany for us is maybe we got the order backwards. Instead of trying to get people into church, we need to get the missionaries into the hood, into the workplace, into the pub, into the coffee shop, like connecting with people where they're at. And you don't really plant churches, you plant the gospel, and a church is the result of the gospel being planted amongst some people. So obviously the biggest challenge, and I think that's why I love what you're doing, Eric, is money. I mean, the statement, you and I have talked about this, it's hard to get people to understand something when their salary depends on them not understanding it. I love the idea of talking to people saying, what is God calling you to do? Do that, and then figure out money. And that's where I think what you're doing is so valuable. But what do you want to do? Who do you feel called to? What place or what people do you want to see transformed? Where would you like to see the kingdom excavated, right? And once you start talking like that, then you say, now we'll figure out money. If we get funded, supported, if we have other jobs, whatever. But let's start with where God's calling us or who God's calling us to.
Yeah, I'm totally with you, man. It's such a different paradigm. I was on the phone with a worship pastor a few weeks back, and he told me he's limited to churches that would hire a full-time worship pastor, which is essentially his words, about 9 US states in the whole country. It's like there's no one in Maine hiring a full-time worship pastor. There's nobody in Minnesota hiring a full-time worship pastor. I mean, maybe there's one or two, but he's like kind of limited to a geographical region. And he's like, I just feel so shackled. If God called me to move to the Bronx where I live tomorrow, I couldn't do it. How would I support myself? I'm like, well, I can't sing or play the guitar, and I figured it out. So I'm sure you can too. I kind of want to.
That's one of the challenges is over 90% of church growth is transfer growth.
100%.
And so we're not actually growing, we're dividing the kingdom into different boxes.
Yeah.
And so you're talking to other pastors in the neighborhood, sort of feeling like I'm growing because your people are coming here. It's not actually, I don't know that that's a good thing.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
Definitely not. So I want to follow this trail. So you go from Philadelphia church, growing church, to I heard something about chicken wings, which I'm assume lunchtime here in New York, so I'm kind of getting hungry, to churches that nail salons, Renaissance fairs, barbershops. Walk us through what did that process look like from church, chicken wings to what you're doing now?
Yeah, so basically we gathered some people. My wife's a real estate or was a real estate agent. Now she does commercial real estate. Edward Jones account is kind of manages commercial stuff now, but at the time she was doing residential real estate. So we gathered with some of her friends and a few of my friends over chicken wings, and got some people together in our home. And I did what I was taught to do, man. I told the story of the blind lady ale house and told them to go do it. And then none of them did it. And I realized that I had to do it with them, that it was going to be more caught than taught, that they'd have to experience it with me, and then we'd have to process it together. And then after seeing it, they go, oh, I can do that. Now I see what it looks like. You just include people around your table. You don't push your faith, but you don't hide it. You bless people as needs arise, and you watch a community form. You begin to process their questions and pray with them and help them understand their gifts and calling. What we started to find is that people would say stuff like this: I didn't even know that I was a Christian until I found myself defending Jesus to my friends. And then I realized, wait a second, I actually believe this stuff now. and then they're going, I think I'm a Christian. And I'm like, you want to mark it? We could baptize you and just, make it a really special moment. And that started to happen. We saw more and more people come to faith. And it took a while, really. I think the idea of moving from, a paradigm that I was really familiar with, grew up in, was trained to do in Bible college, to having 20 micro churches decentralized in this area, didn't happen overnight. I mean, it was really about a year and a half just trying to figure out how to be a community together and how to be on mission. And we saw some people come to faith, and the next year one community turned into two, and then year after that 2 to 4, and 4 to 8. It just kept adding different ones, but it was people that were a part of our community, and then they felt called to open up a business or to use their place of work or to take it into their neighborhood or amongst their friend groups. And because they saw what they saw with us, they went and multiplied it. And then we just coach them. It's kind of low control, high accountability. You go do it. We're going to walk alongside of you, ask you questions. You set some goals. What's the Spirit calling you to do? How are you going to respond to that? What's happening this week? What are your stories? And then we'd follow up with them. Yeah, and it just continued to multiply. And the stories, I mean, I could tell you stories for days. It's like crazy stories. But it's beautiful because here's the beautiful thing. I saw more people come to faith in my kitchen in the first couple years of this than I did with that super fast growing church that we were doing building campaigns. And we'd end the night with just crazy stuff, just kind of weeping about what we had seen in our own home. And it was the first time in my life that we had neighbors persecute us because of who was coming in and out of our house. We had a girl that was coming who, she was friends with one of the girls in our community, and she was like a home health care worker for this girl because she was in a wheelchair. And this girl in a wheelchair was paralyzed from the waist down because of drug use. And so she had her eyes dyed black, her tongue split like a snake. She had demon tattoos all over her, came out of some pretty hardcore addiction. She her friend invited her to come to our place for a barbecue. And when she got there, she said, by the way, these people are like my faith community leaders. And so the first thing the girl said to us when she came into our house was, just so you know, I don't believe in any of that God shit, is the first thing she said. And I just looked at her and said, well, do you like pork? And she's like, yeah. And I'm like, cool, I'll get you some pork. We became friends, and she'd come to some of our social gatherings and hangouts and parties and join us whenever we did stuff to serve. And she'd give our kids rides in her wheelchair. And she was very cynical about anything faith related. She had 3 kids herself. And one night we were talking about Jesus, and she said, I sort of feel like Jesus would like me, because we were talking about Jesus with the prostitutes and the tax collectors and the sinners. And she said, I think Jesus would be for me. We're like, yeah, he would be. And she would always talk about how she hated God. And I said, it's something crazy. Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And so many people talk about how Jesus is like God, but I think we have to recognize that God is like Jesus, that Jesus is the perfect representation of the Father. How do we know what God's like? It's because of Jesus. And she looked at us, looked at her kids, and she said, Mommy was wrong about God not being real. God is very real. She put her faith in Jesus. We baptized her at a local swimming pool. She brought her drug dealer and a bunch of former addict friends to her baptism. She quoted Jesus and Tupac at her baptism. When she came out of the water, she yelled freedom like Braveheart. And then her dealer came to our house the next week, and it's like confessing to burning a shelter down or something. It's like, what do we do when, like, I wasn't prepared in seminary for arson, and it's like, oh, but then you have neighbors going, when you bring people like that into your home, you bring them into our neighborhood. Don't you have somewhere to put them? And so we just watch the highs and lows of people coming to faith and confession and our own lack of love being challenged, and watching God work in such powerful ways that it's probably the best and hardest thing that we've ever done. I could never not do this and feel less alive, for sure.
It's amazing, man. It's really, really moving story. I love that. Quoted Jesus and Tupac. I have a few more questions. I want to open the floor to everyone else. What advice or counsel would you give, the pastor, whether the pastor's in the room right now or will watch the recording later, who says, man, Mike, like, I want those stories, but I work in a church. I have to keep the people happy. I need to, collect the tithes and do the show and the production you talked about earlier. And I feel stuck. Like, what would you say to that pastor? And I maybe I'm 40 years old, and how would I ever change everything now? I got 3 kids and fill in the blank. These are the things that I hear almost every day. So I'm just regurgitating it back to you because I need answers.
No, it's good. So I had a guy come to me. He started a church years ago, decades ago, down in Lynchburg, Virginia. It's like 1 million churches there. And he came up to me after I shared at a conference about some of the stuff we're doing, and he said, I don't have any friends that aren't Christians. And he said, can you teach me? Like, I don't want a whole system overhaul. I just want to live this way myself first. He said, can you teach me how to do this? And a few months later, he sent me photos of his backyard with a fire pit with people he met because he joined a Tai Chi class and started connecting with people who weren't going to come to his church. And he said to me, Mike, I feel like I'm just a missionary disciple maker on the side, and then I do my church work for money. He said church is sort of my vocational job, and then missionary disciple making is what I do for fun on the side. I will say this: I think that um, I'm I don't know that it's helpful to use the word church a lot. I I think really people, your neighbors are probably, if they're not religious or interested in church, it's a turnoff. And your friends or family or the people that are a part of your church, you end up arguing about what the church is or what the church should be. I find it more helpful to invite people to join us in doing the types of things Jesus did and talk mission. Like, what if we helped these people? What if we threw a barbecue and invited all kinds of people around our tables? And then you begin to tell those stories. And if a community forms because people are hanging out over Friday night barbecues or Sunday afternoon football, or neighborhood gatherings in the park playing soccer and eating tacos or whatever. If a community then forms out of that, great. If a church is planted out of that, great. If they came into your existing thing, that's cool. A lot of people won't. But I think recognizing that, really, rather than talk about or argue about what the church is or try to change everything, we just need to have new and different stories. We got to tell a better story. We got to create a different culture. Quit arguing with people. And just, I think Hirsch said to me, the best critique of the bad is the practice of the better. And I think it's true. Instead of criticizing what we think isn't right about what exists, we just need to go do the thing that we're passionate about, that God's called us to. And maybe that's going to lead you out of the church that you're at, because you go, you know what? I don't believe that this is really the most effective way to reach lost people or make disciples. And I feel called to a particular people in a particular place. And maybe part of being a missionary to these people in this place is I need to work amongst them. I need to get a job where they're at. I need to be a part of their daily life. And I'm a missionary to UPS, or I'm a missionary because I open up this restaurant or whatever it is. So I think we've got to start. I think it's beautifully dangerous if people start with, who has God called me to? I'm going to go to them. And then we'll figure out money. If it's with the church, if it's with supporters, if it's another job. But I'm starting with, who has God called me to? What people, what place? We're going to start there.
It's awesome, man. Last question, then we'll open up to the floor. But Mike, you were kind enough to invite me to hang out with your crew last month, the Creo Collective, and I have to say, an awesome group of leaders, all sorts of backgrounds, ages, spread all over the place, and really engaged in what God is doing. So why don't you tell us a bit about Creo? What do you guys do, and how can folks get involved?
Yeah. So Creo Collective means create together. And the idea is that we want to build and collaborate. We want to multiply disciples, expressions of the church, and networks out of the harvest, not transfer growth. So how do we help and encourage people to go as missionaries, make disciples, and then see churches result and then multiply? Every Christian a church planter, and every church a church planting church, and the potential of every seed is a tree, and every tree a potential forest. So we just want to come alongside people, share stories, give permission for people to run, and feel like, one, I've got resources, tools, training, coaching, support, but two, friendship. I'm not alone. There's a whole lot of other people that want to see more when it comes to deeper relationship, transformational discipleship, changed neighborhoods and cities, gospel impact, lost people coming around tables or wherever. So yeah, I'd love to hang with you. I can leave my cell number if you go to creocollective.org. That's our website. If you want to connect to that, Creo Collective on Facebook or Instagram, if you want to look us up on social media channels. But I'll drop my number in the chat too if you want to send me a text, and we can set up a Zoom and talk a little more if you're interested in connecting with us.
Awesome. Awesome, Mike. Man, we really appreciate you taking the time today with everything else you have going on and sharing your story. Casey, Steven, Steve, any questions for our brother while we have him here?
Hey, Mike. Wow, I love it. I am a missionary to a 7-story condo building in downtown Denver, and just got elected to the condo board. And one of my new best friends is an atheist guy that was a city planner for Philadelphia, or no, St. Louis, and we've had some really fascinating conversations. And anyway, so I'm just resonating with everything you're saying and really love it. I'm curious about you talked about the development of going from, you kind of figuring it out, and then, having a group, and then 2 groups, and then 4, and then 8. And then what kind of organizational connectivity is happening between these different groups, if any? I'm just curious what if any structure there is organizationally that kind of keeps you guys moving in the same direction, or do you even care about that? How does that work for you?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Steve. It's changed a lot over the course of, it's been 11 years since we started this here locally. So I can speak to 2 levels. One, what we're doing here on the ground, and then Creo, which is 140 people like me, all over the US, some in Europe, that are doing this type of stuff in different places. So here on the ground, connectivity was, we would offer people, if they wanted to gather on a Sunday morning, different micro churches would take turns hosting. So our beauty school, we got some ladies that feel like they're called to be missionaries through hair and nails. And so most of the girls that come through that are not Christians. Last time I was there, yeah, you'd love it. It was so beautiful. No pun intended. It was so beautiful. Last time I was there, 2 of the girls were Christians. The rest of them weren't. It was a new class because the classes will come through. And these girls most of them would never be interested, and they vocalized that and go into a church service. We talked about Jesus and the kingdom for 2.5 hours, and they were mad when I left. And they're praying for each other each morning because this lady opened the place up because it's her mission. They are cutting hair for homeless people to help them get jobs. They busted a human trafficking ring because they'll traffic women through hair and nails. It's just beautiful, right? So they'll host, and we'll hang out there. Improv theater would host, and different micro churches would come together. Brewery would host, and micro churches would come together and hear stories. Different people would play music. We've just decided that we're no longer going to do Sunday morning. Reason being that we found that some people still really lean too heavily on Sunday. And it was less of a help and more of a hindrance, and that people were less active on mission because they would choose to just come and listen to me and then do a little bit less when it came to their particular mission field. So what we've decided to do now is once a month, the people who have started churches, they've gone out as missionaries and they've seen a church form, or people that see themselves as missionaries, but nothing is yet formed. We'll pull them together once a month, spend the morning together in prayer, having breakfast, doing training. And then once a month on a Friday night, we're going to have a cocktail hour at one of our brewery churches. And people will come together and share stories, and different musicians will play, and artists can show their art, and there will be some teaching and training. And then once a quarter, we'll spend a morning doing just a couple hours of ongoing training and equipping. So kind of that monthly time is an opportunity for us to continue to compare notes and give people tools and resources. And then I'm available as needed. So are our elders who are coaches that have started and multiplied micro churches. They're available as needed for coffee, lunch, to help people process what they're doing and how to do it more effectively. Absolutely. Thanks for saying that. I appreciate it. I do feel like, in talking to some of my friends who are teaching at different seminaries, we've talked about this openly. I'm like, I think a lot of Bible college and seminaries are training people to open up Blockbuster videos. Like, they're training people for a world that no longer exists. And we got to start to think beyond that. You got to think not only Netflix, but what's the next thing? And so people now, I think, are trying to deprogram and reprogram and say, I was trained to do Blockbuster video, but what does it look like now for me to be an incarnational missionary amongst the people and in a place where God's called me? And I'm excited. I think it's a great question to ask. It's really exciting. Thanks for that encouragement, man.
Mike, I think something you said earlier is really appropriate for people in Casey's situation. I feel like I'm kind of doing this. I've got one foot in what I call the 20th century church, but personally, I'm trying to live out what I see the 21st century church being. And like you said, being critical of what's already there isn't really the way forward. It's to live out where Jesus is taking the church. Live it out personally. Bring other people along with you as you can. And so, again, for somebody like Casey, I think the hope there is just start being a missionary and let that be where you get your energy from, and let the church that you're part of pay you for a while until you feel like, okay, now I know what to do. I think that's a good way to transition, instead of just, okay, I'm bagging it, I'm leaving, I'm gonna go for it without any visible means of support. Take time to figure it out, but you don't have to leave anything to start just being a good neighbor and bringing the presence and the peace of Jesus into the community and connectivities that you have in the community already. So anyway, I'm just agreeing with you and just emphasizing that point is really important.
Also, I know we're down to our last few minutes together, but Mike, thank you again. I mean, I've said this before, but IHelpPastorsGetJobs.com, it's kind of like a front to conversations like this. Like, if you don't know what that means, my old barbershop, I don't go there anymore because too many sketchy things have happened there. But you go get your haircut, and you would always notice these people walk in, go to the back, and then leave and not get their haircut. And me being, person I am, didn't really understand why that happened at first. And then a friend of mine who's been living in the neighborhood for a long time goes, oh, it's a front. The barbershop is like the business, but there's more business happening in the back. Probably some shady business that they're trying to hide. And not to call what Mike's talking about today shady business, is not at all, but for some people, they just come out and hear, hey, do this instead of what you've been doing for the last however long. It's a lot to digest. But if they see me and they're like, oh, you can get a job with the skills you've gained as a pastor, it's like, oh, well, that's a haircut. I know what that is. And then I can't tell you the number of people I talk to who are feeling like you are, Casey, who are like, gosh, I gotta find a change. They find that change, and then 6 months later, they call me and they say, I'm having these really great conversations with my neighbor about Jesus, who I never even knew his name until, recently, because I've been so busy with church work. And then I love having a friend like Mike who can say, you got to call Mike Jarrell. He's your guy. I'll help you with the job portion. I'll help you with that live on mission portion. I mean, I can do that too, but I'm also just one person. So I have to be realistic with myself. So I'm so glad that Mike and I have found each other. I know that God has brought us together. So thank you, brother, for your time today, man. That really encouraged us.
Yeah, man, absolutely. And I got to tell you, it was years of stuff like under the surface in my head and in my heart, and a lot of conversations that led up to my experience at the pub, that then led to years of trying to figure out, how do I even do something different? And so my encouragement is, if something is stirring up in your heart and there are some questions about, I really feel like and sense that there could be more when it comes to mission and disciple making, and I want something more, just continue to pursue that, and don't feel like you have to figure it all out at once. That's where you can walk alongside some friends that share a common passion and heart. So that's my encouragement, is I 100% have been where you're at and understand that feeling. And I think we share similar passions and desires based on listening to you guys.
Very cool. Very cool. Any closing questions or any closing thoughts from you, Mike, before we press stop recording?
No, I just really appreciate what you're doing, Eric. I think it's going to be more and more important, as we move into the future. I think a partnership between us to go, there's a lot of people that are going to need to figure out, how do I pay the bills and do the stuff that God is calling me to do. So I'm so glad we met, because I think these two things are going to be an important marriage for sure.
I agree, man. I agree, because I'm only seeing the need increase from, Stephen, your point. This group started 7 or 8 months ago, and the amount of people who have reached out to me asking these questions are only growing. So thanks, Steve. See you later. I'll hit the stop recording button too.